Right. Hey, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of STR Rev Talk. I'm Jan van Kompeno, CPO at Optimizer. Really glad to have you with us here today. I'm joined by Richard Quartel from Lighthouse, who's bringing some fresh, inclusive market data, and Jasper Rivers, head of revenue at the Freewyld Foundry, who's going to share his experience managing owner relations on the ground. Jasper, would you mind quickly introducing yourself to the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. I got started with Airbnb back in 2012, started a podcast, Get Paid for Your Pad. And currently what I do is I'm the head of revenue management for Freewyld Foundry. We manage about 40 portfolios across the world, about 1,500 homes under management.
Okay, very nice. Richard, why don't you do the same?
Yeah, pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. So yes, Richard, so I head up commercial global development for Lighthouse. So for those of you who may be a little bit unfamiliar with what Lighthouse is, we're actually the kind of the umbrella company of what was previously Transparent Intelligence, as I'm sure many of the audiences will probably relate to much closer. But also OTA Insights and a number of other acquisitions. Our objective is to transform data really for any of our enterprise customers to really use in a much more strategic way. So that includes not only short-term rental data, but also hotel data, travel intent data, really to effectively empower them to make much smarter decisions and obviously optimize performance.
Okay. And lastly, we're obviously also joined by our own Bachchan Late, CEO and founder of Optimizer and AutoRank. At our last session, how to adapt your STR revenue strategy for summer 2025, we looked at how the market is becoming more fragmented, guest behavior is shifting, and a one-size-fits-all approach no longer works in this industry. Today, we're taking it a step further. We're going to be looking at how to keep owners aligned as your strategy evolves. We're going to talk about using data to build trust, improving communication, and creating faster alignments between revenue managers, property managers, and lastly, owners. As always, if you have any questions, please drop them in the question section below. We've got a revenue manager ready to answer them live. But first, let's dive into the latest market trends with Richard, who's going to walk us through what the current data at Lighthouse is telling us. Please, Richard.
Fantastic, yeah. So lots of information here to cover, but we'll go quite quickly on this. So wanted to really start with giving a quick overview of the evolution that we've seen, looking at obviously North America, specifically US and Canada, in terms of total bookings. So for the US, we've seen almost a 7% increase in terms of book nights when we compare the first 6 months of 2024 versus 2025. For Canada, the results is actually noticeably lower. It's around actually a drop of 25%. Now, you can see obviously there's a lot of peaks and troughs here for the US. This is certainly very noticeable, but I think for us, it's really understanding what are the possible reasons for the increase in those total book nights. So a couple of things I think come into play here. We're looking at things like certainly early summer travel is kind of being pulled forward. We see a few of the holiday vacation days in the US. This potentially can create a bit of a shift in some travel demand, especially this year in late May. We see travelers probably booking earlier in terms of summer stays. So this can obviously have effect, for example, on May numbers. I think when we look at the evolution overall, certainly the pent-up demand after what was probably quite a cautious 2024, and then looking at things like, the economic stability, these are also effects that can cause that potential rebound. When we talk a little bit about the drops, so I think the possible reasons for decrease in these total book nights, it can be really a combination of several factors, and we can see that really across the evolution graph here. I think the stricter regulations, that is definitely in cities like New York, Toronto, Vancouver. We've seen some of those legislations that came in kind of late 2023, early 2024, they've definitely have an impact on reduced supply. So this can obviously have a downward effect in terms of discouraging hosts. The economic uncertainty, which we talked about as well. I think looking at pricing and ADR tactics. So this is an interesting one when we look at, STR prices actually rose in some of the regions, which we'll also look at in a while. But the book nights probably dropped even as revenue has held pretty steady. So things like also calendar compression, so maybe fewer weekends. We see maybe some of that shifting demand timing, particularly in Canada. So, we're seeing Canadians booking trips in June or later in 2025 compared to 2024. So, yeah, I think there's a number of factors here. And I think the recent weather events and wildfires, obviously these will also be reflected, I think, in future-looking data. Now, the OTA analysis, this is actually quite an interesting one when we look at total supply by OTA and how those compare year over year. So, again, comparing US and Canada here, I think when we look at US specifically, Airbnb has seen a almost 2.5% increase. I think this definitely represents modest growth, but also suggests Airbnb remains very much the dominant player and one of the most expanding platforms as it relates to obviously short-term rentals. Booking.com, this is a really interesting story. Obviously had a very impressive just over 11% increase, which has actually been the strongest growth amongst the US OTAs. Now, it's probably fair to say that this reflects certainly the increasing focus on their alternative accommodation, and obviously looking at probably improving things like host acquisition. That's been a big focus. Booking is certainly gaining share, I would say, in kind of urban or higher ADR areas where it's aggressively going after these hosts. When we probably look on the flip side, VRBO experienced a 9.74% decline, which is, I'd say, pretty significant. Probably a reflection as well of their consolidation. There's certainly competition loss to Airbnb and Booking. And also maybe, again, we probably need someone from the VRBO team to rectify this, but probably also due to strategic deprioritization of maybe some of the markets. In Canada, interestingly enough, Airbnb had a slight decline down almost 3%. This, again, probably not to sound like a broken record, but probably reflecting some of that growing regulatory pressure. We talked about Toronto, for example. Could be also due to host attrition. So maybe Jasper and the others can share a bit more light on this. Booking, again, it's really the golden goose. Actually saw a pretty significant growth of over 25% here. Obviously, this is on a much lower base. So again, this does probably suggest a very strategic push in Canada specifically, and obviously capitalizing a little bit on those regulatory gaps, but also likely how they're targeting much more professional hosts and some of those urban listings.
It's a bit difficult, Richard, to see this on this graph, but are the absolute numbers in terms of OTA distribution, is that similar in Canada and in the US?
So yes, in terms of market share, I would say it's very similar, yes. I need to certainly get back to you on that just to reinforce that assumption. But yes, from my understanding, it is.
Is this also your feeling, Jasper, in your market?
So as far, a couple of things that we are seeing is that Airbnb is actively removing a lot of listings, right? So I think that's something that we have to keep in mind. I think about 400,000 listings worldwide have been removed in the last couple of months. So that's something that it's interesting that Airbnb is still growing, at least in the US. If they wouldn't have removed those listings, the growth would have been quite a bit more significant, right? So that kind of stands out. Kind of stands out to me. Other things that stand out is verbal like going down in listings is definitely very interesting. Booking.com increasing is as expected, as Richard mentioned. Like they have a strong focus on the US, so that makes a lot of sense.
Going to the next slide, Richard, the floor is yours.
Yeah, we one of the things that actually wanted to do for the purpose of this, focusing at those top 50 property managers with 15 or more property listings. It was interesting to see what kind of Lighthouse's also 365-day forward-looking intelligence was telling us around. In this case, we're looking at ADRs. Now, again, it's a little bit of a tricky graph to analyze given the amount of detail. But I think from the comparison, if you look at obviously the average daily rates between what is 2025 year to date, so again, taking the first 6 months and then looking at the next 365 days, I think there are three things that probably would be fair to call out here when you're looking at those graphs. Now, remember, the black graphs are those referring to the forward-looking data. There's definitely widespread kind of ADR increases. So I think this definitely suggests there's optimism despite some of those occupancy declines. When you look at the ranking of those top 50 PMs, the vast majority are actually projecting higher ADRs for the coming year, while forward occupancy is generally down. Second thing to probably call out here is I think the potential overpricing risk really as the ADR growth outpaces demand. So you see again some examples of some of these PMs projecting actually very steep ADR increases, even though their forward occupancy is actually low or declining. So there's a few there like settleliving.com, Hello Landing, Cozy Suites. These are the three that are probably worth calling out. Now, they may be at a slight risk of pricing themselves out of the market, but again, potentially this could obviously lead to underperformance if pricing, and we'll probably talk a little bit more around the importance of pricing dynamics, but if that's not adjusted to match the actual booking trends themselves.
If I may tap in, those are asking rates, right?
Yes.
Or on the books data, okay.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask the same thing. So just to be sure, these are numbers of projected ADRs reported by the property managers themselves, right?
Correct.
Okay. Jasper, how does that look like for you? Do you have any idea about your projected ADR at this point in time?
Yeah, I would say from what we're seeing in our portfolios, like the markets are pretty stable, as Richard mentioned. We are definitely a little bit more occupancy focused than ADR focused. The reason for that is that, as you guys probably are very aware of, the keeping momentum on the OTAs is extremely important, especially now where on Airbnb, if you get a couple 1, 3, or 4-star review, and it can really hurt your visibility. And what we've seen is that when listings kind of drop to the bottom of the search rank, it's very, very difficult to keep the momentum, right? So for us, ADR, we are happy to sacrifice a little bit of ADR to get occupancy going. The way that we think about it is like every booking has direct value, but also indirect value, right? The person can come back, the person can recommend the unit to somebody else. A booking in itself is a signal to the OTA that our listing is in demand. So from what we see, it tends to help get more bookings, if that makes sense. So yeah, we're definitely like in this environment, we're definitely prioritizing occupancy over ADR. One question that I have is when I look at this as well is the orange is the year to date, right? So those are, I'm assuming those are booked prices. Also, I'm not sure until when this data is. if it's until June or until May. But one thing that I would note as well is that, you know, if we're looking, for example, year to date, January through May, for example, and then the next 36 days, and that entices the entire year, right? So I'm not sure exactly how this data is composed, but I would say that yeah, we're definitely not seeing ADR going up in most of our markets compared to, you know, the last couple of years.
Well, I think if I may step in here, we'll be interested if we come back together in a year to see how the asking rates have evolved to booked rates, and to see whether you know, property managers or revenue managers by extent will have priced and which tricks they will have used to secure occupancy. So it's definitely something to look forward to for next year.
Absolutely, and I think our next graph is also going to be a very interesting one. Speaking about occupancy, yeah, especially in markets where supply also increases. Richard, floor is yours again.
So now let's actually, I wanted to also provide a bit more color. Let's get into the weeds a little bit and analyze actually some of the most important performance trends that we see at a regional level. So again, what we're doing here is we're actually comparing June 2024 with the same month this year. So actually for these last three slides, we'll be focusing exclusively on the US market. So looking at this from a macro level trends perspective, occupancy rates have I think slipped, as you can see across the board. There is certainly a slight softening in occupancy when we see across pretty much all the regions, even where demands and also bookings obviously held pretty stable. So the regions, as you can see here, most badly impacted in terms of year over year, same, obviously comparing the same months, declines. Obviously we see Southwest US, Western US, the Hawaiian Islands and the Midwest as well. Those obviously with less variances, you can see from the graphs, New England, Mid-Atlantic states, Rocky Mountains and Southeast US, which is the lowest there, just at around minus 0.61%. Now, if we go quickly on to the next one. So this is now looking at average length of stay. So again, looking at this very much from a kind of a trends perspective, I think with very much the exception of the Mid-Atlantic states, we pretty much what we're seeing is a slight increase year over year in terms of the average length of stays across the regions that we've analyzed. The kind of the top drivers, if you like, for the 2025 figures, I think is looking at things like increase in kind of those blended stays. So, you know, looking more at that leisure traveler, someone who's combining, you know, work and leisure. We especially see that impacts destinations like Hawaii, like Rocky Mountains, or Southeast. The high travel costs. So we mentioned before a little bit of the uncertainties, and we've actually seen fewer trips in general, but with longer durations per trip. So for those, for example, the international inbound travelers still venturing into the US, you know, longer haul visitors obviously, you know, tend to stay longer to justify, if you like, that expense. Certainly also shift towards, I think, what you could also call slow travel. So this is that really tapping into that evolving traveler preferences. You know, they're looking for longer, more meaningful stays, and this is very particular amongst millennials and Gen Z. I think a very positive for all of us, I think, on this call as well. Certainly vacation rentals drive longer average stays than hotels, and this is not only due to flexibility, pricing, but the experience, I think, in general as well.
Do you think, Richard, that vacation rentals are right now stealing business travel or corporate travel?
Yes, I think there has been. I mean, it's, you know, very small margins, but you know, I think it's only fair to say that when you do look at the established global chains, hotel chains in this case, how they've over the last 2-3 years have heavily diversified their portfolios to cater for those vacation rental and looking at that demand to try and tap into it. It's because it's threatening their livelihood. They're not doing it purely, for the fun and joy of it. It's clearly because there's an opportunity there, and they need to ensure that they continue to protect the bottom line. So yes, I would say it's eating away at it, but still relatively small.
Okay.
Is this something that you can confirm, Jasper? Do you guys see an increase in business travelers over the past couple of years?
Not necessarily. I think the business travelers often they stay at hotels because they're part of the loyalty programs. I think for short-term rental platforms to really attract more business travel, I think that they have to roll out a loyalty program, which Airbnb has talked about in the past, but they've never really done that. Booking.com obviously has Genius, but yeah, we definitely haven't noticed a big shift in corporate and business travel to short-term rentals. The only thing we do see is that the digital nomads, right? There's more and more people traveling around the world, working from their laptop. COVID kind of accelerated that trend. And one thing that we do notice is that having things like a stand-up desk and a good workspace, and maybe some weights where people can do some exercises, versus like staying in a hotel where you have access to a whole gym. That's something that we definitely are seeing, that those type of amenities are increasing performance quite a bit for a lot of our units.
Okay, and the last slide that we have today is the evolution of total bookings in the US, which also taps into what you previously mentioned, Jasper, on following a more occupancy-based strategy in which you're willing to sacrifice ADR, but then achieving a higher booking velocity or a booking momentum, as we could call it. Yeah, Richard.
Yeah, I think just finally a quick one here. Again, looking at those specific trends, I think very clearly we can see that in general terms, total bookings declined slightly when we're looking at all those regions. Certainly, most or all regions experienced a decrease in obviously those total bookings. I think again due to a number of factors. You could probably call out the shifting travel kind of patterns or trends, pricing strategies, the economic uncertainty. Certainly, again, as we're talking about the US, it's not just been the uncertainty that's been kind of created in general around the tariffs and trade disputes, but it's more around even as far as you could even attribute the border controls and policies on immigration, the international kind of polarization of kind of the recent this America First rhetoric. I think this has definitely created a shift in how foreign policy is altered. But I think just generally in terms of traveler confidence. So these are all things that I think do play into it.
Thanks, Richard. I think it was a great overview on a couple of things that are happening in the market right now, and it ties right into what we want to talk about next, mainly. With all of these changes happening, economic uncertainty, how are we now going to communicate these shifts to owners in a way that actually builds trust, keeps everyone aligned, especially when things are moving that quickly? Jasper, could you tell us a little bit more about the most asked owner questions at Freewyld? How do you usually react to those?
Yeah, for sure. So just to be clear, like we work with large short-term rental companies. So our clients are the business owners, the short-term rental operators, but they get a lot of questions from their clients, right? They usually pass those on to us because they're not sure how to respond to them. I would say in general, owners don't really understand revenue management. They don't really understand how dynamic pricing works. They typically look at very anecdotal things. Like they'll look at one booking and then look at a property that they know is also a short-term rental that's kind of similar, and then they'll look at their prices. And oftentimes the question is like they think that we can get a higher ADR, right? Owners are often very emotionally involved with their property, right? They usually overestimate a little bit of how nice it is. And so that's by far the biggest question that we always get is like, hey, I know, we got this booking at $200, but, I see this other 2-bedroom down the road that's, I look at the prices in Airbnb and they're priced at 300. We don't know if they're actually getting booked there. And it's very rare for owners to actually look at real data. So yeah, that's usually the questions that we get the most is like, hey, can we charge higher rates? Why do we have so much occupancy? Why is the weekend not booked? That's another thing is like owners always want to have the weekends booked, right? If the weekdays are not booked, they won't bark at that typically, because I think they understand that weekends are more popular than weekdays. But if any weekend isn't booked, like we often get those questions from owners or like, hey, why is the weekend not booked, right? So I think when it comes to revenue management, the way that we deal with that is that if we have a client that we know that certain owners are always looking at the weekends, then we typically will try to pace ahead a little bit on the weekends, because we know if a weekend isn't booked, our client is going to get a phone call from that owner, and obviously that takes time, and that complicates matters for our clients. So in a lot of cases, we want to make sure that when it's like Tuesday or Wednesday, we prefer to have the weekends booked, because if it's Thursday or Friday, that owner might be calling our client, and that's something that we're trying to avoid.
I think a lot of owners are obviously emotionally invested in their properties. Do you think those kind of reactions are all, emotional ones?
Yeah, I think it's emotional, but it's also lack of knowledge, lack of understanding, right? If you're a homeowner, like you don't necessarily understand how the business of short-term rentals work in the first place, right? You just look at like, hey, am I booked? Am I not booked? At what price am I booked? Right? That's pretty much as far as it goes. And as we all know, there's a lot more to it, right? It's quite a complicated business to be in. And then the revenue management side, obviously there's a lot of factors involved, right? There's seasonality, there's like, you have to take into account like the momentum on the OTAs. We have the listings, the ratings, the reviews. There's so many factors to take into consideration when you're making price decisions, and it's almost impossible to explain that all to the owners, right? So I think there's definitely some education. I think one thing that we always recommend to our clients is like that they set expectations beforehand with when they onboard a new owner, right? The expectation that you want to set is really that the owner should not be involved and looking over our shoulder. Like you really want to communicate to the owner like, hey, this is our job. Not everything we do is going to make sense. We'll send you your check at the end of the month, and for us to maximize your revenue, it's best that you don't get involved too much, right? That's the reality. So it's setting those expectations, and then I think it's also just keeping in mind like what the preferences of the owners are. Some owners they just want to be booked and they don't look at price as much, right? Versus other owners, they might not care so much about the occupancy, but they are like very price sensitive, so they don't want to sell their house at below a certain price, right? So I think it's more of like understanding what are the owners focused on, what do they think is important, and taking that into account when you're making your pricing decisions.
To extend on that point, Jasper, I completely agree. But also, I think for owners, it's sometimes very conflicting because their property manager is trying to educate them about certain aspects, certain strategies, and then the mainstream media is telling the world is going to blow up, tariffs are going to get rid of the vacation rental industry. So it's, as an owner, I strongly believe they don't consume the same media as the four of us, and probably the people in the audience as well. But they consume mainstream media that doesn't have all the nuances, all the things that a revenue manager has. So it's hard to make the translation as well for an owner. Okay, my property manager is telling me A, but the media is telling me the world is going to end, to say it in extreme. So yeah, I think I could agree on the fact that it can be solved by education, but education has to be a willingness from the owner.
You mentioned, Jasper, that you're with Freewyld mainly following an occupancy-led strategy in which you strategically underprice the market in order to get a lot more occupancy and therefore, in the end, hopefully outperform the market in terms of RevPAR and revenue. You also mentioned that some owners are obviously emotionally invested in their property and they want to see extremely high ADRs, for example. So to what extent do you allow owners to make decisions on their homes, and to what extent do you let that influence, let's say, your portfolio strategy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in the end of the day, we have to respect the boundaries that the owner set. So if they don't want to sell their unit under a certain price, then we have to respect that, right? Because in the end of the day, like, our client is the property management manager, right? So the client of our client, if our client has a problem with their client, then that's not good for us. That's not good for our client. So yeah, what we do is, like, when we onboard a new client, we get that information, right? So we have a spreadsheet where we have all the minimum prices. Oftentimes there's restrictions around minimum night stays as well. But we do our best to educate our clients' owners of like how much money are they leaving on the table by giving us those restrictions, right? So we sometimes create like revenue projections. Let's say, for example, right, we have one house in Australia where we have to charge a minimum rate of like $1,300 a night, which is pretty high, although it's a very nice house. And we have to have a 5-night minimum stay, right? So it's extremely restrictive. So this home is making, let's say, $20,000 or $30,000 a year, where it could be making, maybe like 150, right? And so we do show that to those owners of like, hey, look, here's another home that we have in our portfolio where the owner is allowing us to maximize revenue by not giving us any restrictions. So we are free to do whatever we want. And look, we're making like 140K, right? Your home is doing 30,000, and it's because you're giving us these restrictions, right? So it's like, yeah, we will respect it, but it's also our job to show them how much revenue they're missing out on, because that way they can make a better, more informed decision on what restrictions they want to give us.
Yeah, and maybe if I could add to that, I think how I see it as a property manager, it's being able to educate them to overcome the emotional anchoring, because the example you gave, Jasper, the 5 minimum length of stay, a minimum rate, that's very hard to sell sometimes. That's probably because they, as mentioned before, have an emotional investment with it. Maybe they live there, maybe they furnish the property themselves, maybe they did everything and they really value it themselves as this. But it's, market is changing, and everything we see happening today, the rates are changing, OTAs are becoming way more complex, the whole distribution cycle, and it's all about educating the owners.
Yeah, for sure.
It's all about educating the owners. But Jasper, you previously mentioned some owners just don't get dynamic pricing, and I think it's going to be, for some at least, impossible to make them completely understand how you're doing a certain strategy. Do you then focus on the why, on the outcome, on the revenue, on the revenue that they perhaps left on the table? How exactly do you do that in practice?
Yeah, I mean, that's, in the end of the day, the owner wants to make the most money possible, right? Not all of them, right? Because there's also owners who they have a house and they're like, hey, if I can rent it out for $1,000 a night, I'll do it. But if not, I'll rather let it sit empty. Owners are also often concerned about wear and tear. And so like when you go below a certain price, in their mind, they're thinking like, well, this is not worth it because it's going to be wear and tear, and I'm not going to be making that back at a certain price. They don't really understand like the value of a booking, the indirect value of a booking, right? So that's something that we often have to educate them on. And then another misconception is that owners usually think that a lower price is always going to attract a worse quality guest, which at some price levels that's true. But if you go down from like 1,300 a night to like 800 a night, it's not necessarily gonna change the quality of the guest very much. So that's another thing that we often have to educate the owners on as well.
And it's those indirect effects, I strongly believe, that are often the hardest to educate them on, because the direct, you see, you have a booking at a certain rate, they see, but sometimes receiving a booking at a maybe lower rate just to get the momentum going on those OTAs, just to get your booking page momentum going, that's fueling into their long-term profitability of their unit. But as owners, they have their app probably or an email where they say, okay, booking of X 30% below what I emotionally anchored in my mind to get. So the indirect effects are the hardest to educate, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can give an interesting example actually from one of our clients. They work with an owner who has like 20 very similar units in a building, right? And they were challenging us on our minimum prices. They were saying that our minimums are way too low, right? And so what we did is we actually ended up doing an A/B test with them, where they gave us the freedom to do whatever we wanted for half of the rooms, and they gave us their boundaries for the other half of the portfolio. And so we ran an A/B test for like a month, and their minimum prices were way too high. So we already knew that. So we already knew like, okay, we're nearly not going to have as many bookings for that side of the portfolio. Yes, they will be at a higher price, but yeah, to your point, Bart-Jan, you lose so much momentum if you don't get a lot of bookings. And so after a month, we looked at the results, and our side of the portfolio did about 30% more revenue than their side. And so then after seeing those numbers, they then that convinced them to now let us do whatever we want with the entire portfolio. So sometimes if the owner has multiple units, sometimes they just you have to prove it to them. Or if they only have one unit, sometimes, just telling them like, okay, we'll run with your boundaries for a while, see how it goes. And then if they don't make any money, then they'll often come back and say like, okay, well, what do you guys think, right? So yeah, it's all, you're dealing with human beings, right? And so it's also just kind of feeling out like where they're coming from. Are they open to suggestions? Are they open to reason, or are they very stuck in their ideas? Like, you kind of have to be a little bit of a psychologist, I guess, sometimes.
Yeah, and to your point, I strongly agree that use cases can help a lot. Seeing a use case or seeing that A/B test can really alter their mind sometimes.
Yeah, 100%. And we always tell our clients like, hey, when you're scaling, like, find the right partner to work with, right? If you have an opportunity to manage somebody's homes, but you have a feeling that person is going to be looking over your shoulder all day, then ask yourself the question like, do you really want to work with that owner, or do you want to go for somebody who's a bit more hands off, right? Because it'll just save you a lot of time when you work with owners who are just letting you do your job, and they'll take the check at the end of the month, and that's it.
In a dynamic pricing contest, so I think very naturally we've mainly discussed minimum rates so far, because minimum rates are also, in my experience, a very big part of what an owner finds extremely important, both in terms of emotional investment in their property, but also in terms of wear and tear. Indeed, like you mentioned, it's a bit of a psychological borderline under which they do not want to sell their property. In your guys' experience, are there any other remarks from owners that keep coming back that have nothing to do with minimum prices?
Yeah, I would say typically minimum prices and minimum night stays are the two boundaries that we have to deal with the most. Interestingly enough, occasionally it's also the maximum price. We have some owners who are uncomfortable with when the price goes above a certain level, because they are worried that the property doesn't live up to the expectations of the guests, and so they're worried about the bad reviews. Sometimes I think it's also like they think it's too much money, and they kind of feel guilty almost for renting it out at those prices, or they're worried about like negative feedback from the guests. So that's a lot rarer. Usually it's just the minimum prices and the minimum night stay settings is usually where we run into the biggest challenges.
The max price is actually a quite interesting one, because this is like an ancient heuristic. Like people have like they value your property based on what you pay it for. But we actually did in Belgium. We did a research on, okay, where are the baddest reviews coming from? Is it from the lowest ADRs or the highest ADR? And we actually found that it was that the heuristic, the higher you pay, the lower the ADR, was not valid in the majority of the cases. So I think, again, fueling into what we earlier said, giving owners such a use case that sometimes market conditions call for higher ADRs. Everyone thinks it's normal to pay crazy rates on New Year's, and then your value perception is, it's New Year, it's very busy in the city, and I'm lucky to have an apartment, so I pay for it. But it's those other days that's needed education.
Yeah, 100%.
Also, something I wanted to get your guys' opinion on. We've previously discussed A/B testing, so of certain properties. So let's say that you have one building, 20 very similar properties. You want to test for 1 or 2 months your minimum rates versus the owner suggested minimum rates, let's say. In my experience, very often in these kind of situations with minimum rates that are way too high, sometimes you find yourself in a situation where you don't have a booking for 3 weeks. For 1 month, for 5, or even 6 weeks. Those kind of listings, I always like to call them, just dead listings. They're in the dead zone. As soon as you haven't had an OTA booking for over 3-4 weeks, you get into very, very dangerous territory. And then activating that listing again, or trying to get that listing booked again, is tremendously more difficult than it was before, because very often after that you find yourself in an even worse situation. That also something that you can confirm, Jasper?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's very much a momentum game, and we see that more and more, especially in a weak market, right? If the market's booming, then there's so much demand that and limited inventory, and it doesn't matter. Like everything will get booked as long as it's like kind of decent. But especially going into slower season, it's very, very difficult. That's why we have a strong focus on occupancy. Like ideally we don't really want to drop below like 70% occupancy, because then it just becomes a downward spiral. And to your point, then you almost have to consider it a completely new listing. As in, like, when we launch a new listing, we always tell the owners, like, the first couple months, don't worry about how much you're making. It's purely to get the ball rolling, right? We just got to get as many heads and beds. We can just got to get as many people as possible coming through the doors. And when a listing like kind of stalls, that you kind of have to restart it, right? And so you have to go through that process again, and that can cost a lot of money. So it's better, even if you give the property away for free for a couple of days here and there, it's probably still better than leave it empty, because those bookings are, those booking signals to the OTAs are just so important. And right now it's very easy to sit in the corner where nobody finds you and just sit empty for a couple months, and then that can cost you so much money, because then also your visibility for the high season is coming down, right? So yeah, the worst thing that you can do is just not have any activity in your listing.
Absolutely.
From an OTA perspective, I couldn't agree more. It's, as you said, Jasper, those first 3-4 weeks / months, depending on your market size and on your market, are pivotal, because you're building up like the data behind your listing. You're building reviews, you're building the clicks in the algorithm, you're building people rejecting or not accepting a booking, giving those incentives to Airbnb to really determine where you will be ranked and where you will be ranked, where, you know, by extension, your booking probability for the future. So something we also have at Optimize, when people say, look, I tried revenue management, I tried dynamic pricing, I want to do OTA optimization. And we say, look, it's all together. You have to sometimes allow a lower rate just to ensure long-term profitability, because they all tune in, they all blend in together very well.
I think
absolutely.
I would just add, actually, that is exactly the importance of this process of educating. It's not, you know, pulling one lever is going to fix all my problems. It's having really that very holistic approach of, you know, utilizing technology, of hosts being far more invested in understanding market dynamics. It's understanding what is happening on a local level. It's understanding how can you build that competitive intelligence. There's so many things which, you know, to a certain extent, you don't want the host to probably be too interested in it. Then it makes your work as a manager a little bit more complex. But you know, I think it's also just about, you know, making sure that you are addressing all those things, because they all play a significant factor in giving you that visibility as a property. So,
is it possible as an operator to really or possible and even necessary to discuss this kind of heuristic approach with owners, or is that going a little bit too far? Because revenue management, dynamic pricing is already it's already a difficult concept on its own. If we also have to start explaining about OTAs and listing optimization and all those kind of things, doesn't it get a little bit too complicated at that point, Jasper?
It does.
From an owner perspective.
Yeah, and I mean, absolutely does, which is why, you know, I think it's really important for property managers to not just take on any unit, and not just look at if the unit fits your portfolio, but does the owner fits the profile of somebody that you want to work with, right? Because you can get into massive rabbit holes on so many different topics, and you know, it's like the 80-20 thing, right? It's like 20% of your clients take up 80% of your time. And you know, as we all know, running a short-term rental business, especially as you're scaling, especially when you're in that growth phase where you don't have a lot of team members yet and you're wearing a lot of hats, right? As the owner of the company, you don't have that much time. You have a lot to do. There's always a fire to put out. I mean, it's a 24-hour business, you know, and so saving time is extremely valuable, right? So I think the best advice I can give is, you know, try to work with people who are emotionally in a place where they can let go of the property and just rely on your expertise and trust in you as a professional. Because yeah, you can get into so many different like rabbit holes, and I've seen some of our clients like having like email threads of like, you know, hundreds of back and forths of like discussing all sorts of things with the owners, and it's just such a time suck that like it's just not worth it. You know, you got to also look at how much are you making by managing a certain unit, right? And how much time are you spending on that unit? And calculate how much are you getting paid, right? And make sure that balance is good, because otherwise you can easily dig a hole for yourself and completely burn out in this business.
Yeah, I can agree. If I take this perspective from more business way, like it's, everyone wants new clients, everyone wants to grow, but sometimes the wrong clients make you grow in the wrong direction, and everyone knows this is like this heuristic and this common sense in a lot of other businesses, but for a lot of vacation rental businesses, they think I just need more units and this is the right direction of growing. But it's actually the owner, the persona of the owner, the risk profile, the risk aversion, is the way how they want to be treated. Some owners like to be on the phone 2 hours playing the psychologist, or treating you as their psychologist. So it's, choosing the right people to grow with.
And all time spent on owners is time that you can't spend, obviously, on working on those listings, working on continuously optimizing not only your revenue strategy, but also your OTA and distribution strategy, which is something that takes a lot of time. To wrap up this session, so I think we've heard a couple of very interesting things. So first of all, it's going to be very important to work with the right owners, I think, as a property manager, to really control the input of new listings or new properties in your portfolio. Make sure everyone is on the same page. Make sure that expectations are very clearly set at the beginning of the collaboration. Make sure that those expectations are also aligned. And then obviously in that route that you take on together, there are obviously going to be minor misunderstandings. There are things you can do. You can A/B test some of the owner's suggestions. You can show them with data, with revenue, that hey, some of these strategies that you're suggesting, they're not working, because this is why we are doing those strategies. There are a lot of things changing in the STR and vacation rental space. Supply had increased after COVID. Occupancies are now dropping year over year. Total number of bookings made in June 2025. I find that a very interesting graph, Richard, that has dropped significantly in the US. So a lot of things are happening at the same time, and it's not easy to spend all of your time explaining what you're doing rather than just doing it. Thank you very much, Jasper. Thank you very much, Richard and Bachan, for this very interesting session today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
My pleasure.